Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It's my pleasure to have Sean Jobst on the show. Sean, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. You're an investigative journalist, independent researcher, and traveler. At least that's how you describe yourself on your blog. Your blog is sjobst at blogspot.ca. It's sjobst.blogspot.ca. And, well, you have a lot of interesting posts on there. And, well, one thing is you recently came back from, I think it was Spain, where you gave a lecture there on Zionism and globalism. And maybe that's a good way to start about what we're going to talk about tonight. Zionism and globalism. What's all that about?
Well, if you look at the links between, you look at, everywhere you look at the Zionism issue, you see the issues with the connections with the international banking system, with them basically having a subversive element in each country. The major powers, they try to have a subversive element that they want to, distort the policy in their favor. That's tied into the banking system also. Then you have the role of like the Kalergi plan, and how it's mostly a lot of Zionists kind of advocating the mass immigration in Europe, but at the same time, and exclusively Jewish Israel. Then you have Mossad, and how Mossad uses Sayanim in every country, which is kind of like these sleeper agents. So you look at all these different elements, and it kind of you see it it's very tied into globalism. It's not just concerned with the state of Israel. It's more than that.
Is this sort of culturally linked to the diaspora and the dispersal of the Jewish nation going way back, in the first century A.D. And just developing from there? You mentioned a subversive quality. I know E. Michael Jones wrote a book called The Revolutionary Spirit of the Jews.
Excellent book, yeah. He's an excellent writer.
And I've interviewed him a few times. In fact, I interviewed specifically on that book. I read that book, and he says this revolutionary spirit, this subversive quality that you speak of, sort of it reverberates throughout history, and it ebbs and it waxes and wanes depending on the circumstances and the times. So what you're saying is this tend towards globalism through the banking system. You would say that there's a predominant, or at least a very decisive Jewish influence in this, as opposed to, say, maybe someone would look at the British Empire and the Anglophiles, but you're looking at sort of the Zionist angle, the Jewish angle here, as being a prominent role, if not the most prominent.
Yes, most definitely. Yeah, it can't be ignored.
Mm-hmm.
Those that, they want to say Jesuits, British Empire, all these other things, it's basically they're distractions.
Mm-hmm.
No matter where you look at media, you look at banking institutions, you see a disproportionate number of Jews. Now, it goes without saying, I'm not saying every Jew is involved, and that every non-Jew is an angel, because there's a lot of bad non-Jews involved, Gentiles involved in it as well. But it's predominantly Jewish. That can't be ignored.
Yeah, definitely. When we speak of Jews and the Jewish power structure, it's the same way that someone may say the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. We're not saying every Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, or the Germans invaded Poland. We're not saying every German invaded Poland. We speak in these terms. We're talking about the Jews as a political body, as a people, and they organize collectively. And they act collectively, so we have to recognize these agencies that represent their collective power. And we're talking about the Jewish oligarchs, right? Like anything, the vast majority of Jews, like the vast majority of Gentiles, are more or less clueless or helpless in this. It's the elites we're talking about, correct? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And in some sense, you can say that a lot of common Jews are actually just as much victims of this, because it's like a Talmudic mentality that it segregates them from other people. It says that they're different than other people. They're better than other people. And also, but there's a conspiratorial element too. If you look at Herzl, for example, in his diaries, in many places he talked about anti-Semitism anti-Semites would be allies of Zionism. And then up to the modern day, you see some of the false flags. For example, Iraq in the 50s. It was Haganah, which is one of the precursors of the Mossad. They committed a lot of these bombings to try to goad the Iraqi Jews into Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
yeah, of course, the King David bombing in 1947, 48. That was Ergun.
Yes, 47. Yeah.
And that was Menachem Begin, who later became Prime Minister of Israel, right?
Yeah.
So
and a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Yeah.
So-called peace.
Yeah, so-called peace. This is difficult because obviously, when you point this out, you're going to be labeled an anti-Semite, sort of a neo-Nazi or something. But of course, as you point out, I think you're aware of, there's a strange alliance between, National Socialism and Zionism, because they both had a similar objective, in Europe, particularly Germany. They wanted to get the Jews out of Europe, particularly Germany. And, the way they did this was, perhaps, working with the National Socialists to precipitate a crisis.
Yeah, there were definitely elements within the National Socialist elite, because I've studied this in depth too, and there were some elements like Fritz Grobe and others, and Johannes von Leers, who were more pro-Arab when it came to Palestine. But then there was also elements like Adolf Eichmann and some others, and a lot of the elements of the SS that were the ones that spearheaded the Havara Agreement, for example. Mm-hmm. That, it was basically a means justifies the end. Ends justifies the means issue for them.
And of course, that's written up by Edwin Black in the transfer agreement. So this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is this strange alliance where, yes, it was worked out that as the Jews left Germany, they would put their money into an account that the German government would control, but it would be directed towards promoting development in Palestine. I believe that's how it worked out. So it was they both had a common goal there. But as far as going back to Zionism and globalism, they promote a certain cosmopolitanism, which I gathered from your address is a key part of this capitalist ideology that the West seems to be enraptured with or controlled by. We're given this dialectic capitalism versus socialism. And we have to accept that the economic institutions and structures that we've inherited throughout the centuries, one of them is central banking, usury, these things, and also this ideology of free trade, the British idea of free trade, which is kind of used as a solvent to break down local cultures and traditions. We're seeing now with the corporate monoculture. And you discussed corporate monoculture and Zionism in your address and in your articles. Do you want to address what that exactly is and why it poses a threat to communities, real human liberty, and all things that are decent on this planet?
Well, because ultimately, they want to, level out every single distinct culture other than the Jewish culture, and make it everybody like a new consumer identity, like that everybody's a debt slave. Everybody is in this constant elusive rush for like more goods, more like things that they confuse wants for needs. All this consumerism, and from that you go in more debt too. So that's the source of the banker's power. Mm-hmm. And you can control people who don't have a culture more easily, who don't feel a connection to other people. And if everybody's competing in some kind of consumerist rush for more consumerism, everybody's, it's like a divide and conquer element as well.
Yeah, this idea, you're talking, they want to make sure everyone's sort of deracinated, cut off from their roots.
Yes.
And the only thing they have in common is what they consume, and that's you develop this development of a consumerist culture. Now, I can see, there's a lot throughout history where, if you look at particularly pornography and abortion, were advocated by Jews, more or less. They were very prominent in promoting that. And of course, their role in entertainment and motion picture industry, particularly Hollywood for the longest time for about 30 years, better part of 40 years, was restrained by the production code that was imposed on them, largely by the Catholics.
Yes.
But then you had this plan really starting during the Second World War, but really after, with urban renewal, the creation of suburbia, the interstate highway system. This is a very sinister but very aggressive social engineering plan to fundamentally change the demographics of the nation, to change its culture, to change its politics. And one example of that would be the dispersal and destruction of these ethnic Catholic neighborhoods in these cities, which was the source of the Catholic Church's political power in the United States. Of course, the pinnacle was the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960. But the creation of suburbia, many of these ethnic Catholics, Italian Catholics, German Catholics, Poles, Irish Catholics, would be dispersed in the suburbia, chased out largely under the name of integration. A white flight was the objective. It wasn't really integration. That was just the excuse. When they went into suburbia and they, left their ethnic enclaves, they lost their identity, and they became consumers, as opposed to Catholics, Irish Catholics or Polish Catholics. Have you looked anything into that? How this was coordinated at all? I mean, because I look at the think tanks, and University of Chicago was behind this. How does this? I mean, you have in the mid-century you had the American Jewish Committee and the publication of the Authoritarian Personality. At the same time, you had the Rockefeller Foundation promoting folks like Kinsey who aren't Jewish. And there's a sort of a WASP Jewish alliance here. They were for about 20, 30 years. They seem to be targeting the ethnic Catholics. Have you looked anything into that? What was going on there?
On that, just basically what I read from E. Michael Jones, which is interesting because that's actually my demographic. Like, I'm not professing Catholic now, but I come from a cultural Catholic background. Mm-hmm. But my father was an immigrant. He came in 1957, and my mother's her grandparents. And so on both sides they're Catholic, and so basically I defer to E. Michael Jones and his pioneering research. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and I like how he ties into how it coincided when Holocaust propaganda started as well, when they started promoting that.
That's interesting because
and then you can and then that happened to coincide with Vatican Council II as well. So you see all these different things, and you compare the research of Michael Hoffman as well. Yeah, and you kind of see this within the early and mid 20th century within the Catholic Church. There's this softening of the old laws against usury and banking. So you see all these different things coalescing to basically weaken the Catholics' attachment to their tradition, because their tradition, it prevented them from the economic machinations, basically, of the banking system. Mm-hmm. And they had a strong social welfare system as well. That, yes. There wasn't quite a reliance upon the government, the state.
That's right. The good example would be the Catholic school system, which relied on vocations, high birth rates, strong Catholic communities, parishes. The schools were supported by the parish, not so much by tuition. And what you saw with after Vatican II, the breakdown of vocations and the liberalization of the church. This is the spirit of Vatican II versus the letter of Vatican II. There was a lot of debate within the church what was really intended there. But nevertheless, you saw this post-Vatican II sort of the church taking a very ironic position. This is Americanism that E. Michael Jones and also David Wenhoff writes about. And but with Vatican II, you see CIA and Freemasonic infiltration into the Catholic Church, along with the Jewish influence, meaning the the Catholic Church reaching out for dialogue with Nostra. Yes. I think it's Nostra Aetate. And that
Nostra Aetate.
Yeah, and that being construed as sort of a surrender of the Catholic Church to Jewish power. Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately.
But the Vatican II is very important. Yeah. The demographic backbone of the Catholic Church was weakened after Vatican II, and this is also this coincides with a very broad cultural and social agenda in the aftermath of the American Jewish Committee's publication of the Authoritarian Personality, which called for the sexualization of American culture for the purposes of weakening the family, particularly the male role model, the father figure. And there's that subversive quality that you speak of, correct?
Yes, and you probably seen an interview with Aaron Russell when he was talking to one of the Rockefellers.
Yeah, Nicholas Rockefeller, yeah.
Yeah, Nicholas Rockefeller, and he confided to him that was about, getting the kids out of their, the family structure, and putting them in these schools, and then having the women work as well as part of the, expand their tax base, and
yes.
you could argue the debt base as well.
Yes,
there's more debt, so all these different elements coalescing.
Do you think it goes back? I mean, one of the things is because most Americans have been conditioned to accept, and it's something I was conditioned to accept with my economic training, was the necessity of interest rates and usury, the normalization of usury. And most people are pretty much just conditioned to accepting it as a norm. It's what you charge to borrow money. Of course, it's aggravated greatly by the fact that the money that's loaned out isn't money that exists. It's money that's created after you write the loan.
Yeah.
It's particularly in cities when that's the case. But that's one thing that Ian Michael Jones writes about in Barren Metal. His book is sort of the third in a trilogy. I think he wrote Libido Dominandi regarding sexual
liberation.
Sexual liberation as a political weapon, as slavery. Sexual
Yes.
liberation is slavery, more or less. And then, of course, there's the second book was the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit.
The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. Yeah.
And this latest one he finished last year, which I finished I guess it was late last year, Barren Metal. And he gets in sort of the structure of financing, and you write about the usury. Is usury the heart of the matter here? I mean, as far as the sort of the financial structure, how we're sort of through usury, through monetary debasement, are not only are all our passions and our appetites whetted and exploited, but not our options are narrowed because we have to borrow in order to maintain our living standards because we're faced with constant monetary debasement. So, is it the banking system?
Yeah, it does ultimately go back to the banking system, but now if you look at these, it's not purely economic, but the economic motive is what we can see, but like as means towards that end, they also have these social structures like you were talking about, where you have to change the people's social structures and how they relate to each other, their family structures, all that. You have to kind of soften them up. So the bankers can then go in for the kill, basically, and control them. You have to make them basically enslaved to their lowest desires, their ego. You gotta make them, always want new things, the things that, the advertising industry, which is closely tied into both the psychoanalyst, because, Edward Bernays was Freud's nephew.
Double nephew.
But it's also, but then he was also, he received Rothschild's money. Rothschild and Rockefeller money. So you see all these, it's coalescing there. And that's why in the system since 1945 in the West, which coincide with Bretton Woods, is you also see a cultural Marxism. So the Marxists kind of move over to the social and cultural realm, and they let the capitalist system, handle the financial realm. And it's a kind of an alliance right there, convergence, basically.
Yeah, this is like
dialect.
Yeah, Wilhelm Reich and the mass psychology of fascism, I think, right?
Yes.
And then there's always Eros and Civilization, by what's his name, cultural Marxist.
Marcuse.
Herbert Marcuse, who went out to Hollywood, correct?
Yeah. And then you had also Michel Foucault.
That's right. In Hollywood. And he's the one that E. Michael Jones says derailed whatever was good about the left.
Yes.
You give me sex, give me free sex. I don't care if I'm in debt because I'm sexually liberated, and that's an interesting insight because reading from E. Michael Jones, you'll get the psychology behind that is that if you are a sexual revolutionary, or you get taken in by the sexual revolutionaries, and you become a slave to your passions, and you're driven by this inordinate or misdirected sexual appetite, you're not going to have a family to take care of, nor will you be willing to really take care of your family. So you're not going to be so concerned about your job and getting a raise and saving.
No.
And that goes to what you're talking about, changing the institutions and sort of the culture to change the political constitution.
Yeah.
So
well, yeah, it goes back. You could argue it goes back to the Great Depression. There's another argument you can say. Mm-hmm. And I remember when my father came to America, his stepfather was an American soldier, so he came there, but he was a farmer in Missouri. And I remember when I was younger, I used to hear about them and talk about the farming subsidies, and all of a sudden around that time, and especially after World War II, the certain farming systems that the government was, it was weakening. Even then, it was weakening the family farms, mm-hmm. and you had the growth of big agribusinesses. So that also had to move people to the city, and all these other economic
so it's
problems that they were basically creating.
It's similar to like the enclosure movement in England.
Yes.
Where prior, and this also coincides with the English Reformation, which was kind of a looting operation of the Catholic Church property, but the Catholic Church maintained a social network or support system for a way of life. And when they destroyed that, when they looted the monasteries and took all the church's wealth and dispersed it to a few, noble families for the oligarchy that really controlled England, you had all these people forced off their ancestral homelands and into the cities, and all of a sudden you had pauperism in England. And that was used as a pretext to ship people out to man the empire, places like Australia. Same thing occurred in Ireland too. Similar thing, where people were forced off the land and then forced to work for cheap wages or shipped abroad. But this provided sort of surplus labor for the developing industrial sector, and you saw that. You saw it. A different but a similar process going on in the United States. The sort of this not collectivization of farms, but the corporate concentration of farming.
Yes, yeah.
Of course, which is very disruptive to local communities. But you do get higher crop yields and lower prices, right? It goes back to your this sort of the commodification of everything, sort of this Homo economicus, so that's the only standard or something we judge everything by.
Yeah, it's all about based on profits. Mm-hmm. Profits is what they, everything, healthcare, everything. They're even trying to control the water. Mm-hmm. Even natural resources. I mean, everything they're saying is that they want to make a profit from it.
And that goes to sort of this. Wouldn't that go back to the sort of the Newtonian vision of things? This English way, the sort of the English empiricism and American pragmatism. Yeah,
well, it does go a lot back to the Calvinist mm-hmm. ethic. I would say, where the amount of profits you had and wealth was somehow a sign of divine grace. Mm-hmm. So that you were somehow more blessed by God than those who didn't have that. And there's some convergence between the Max Weber theory with the Werner Sombart theory, because the Max Weber theory of the Calvinism that prepared the way for the Jewish banking mm-hmm. interests to, then they came back, they kind of piggybacked on that. And, well, if you look at in the late 1600s with Cromwell's revolution, for example, it basically opened up to the Rothschilds to come into, and all these other Jewish banking interests.
That's right, because Cromwell, in return for financing from...
Yes, Manasseh ben Israel.
Yes, that was something I didn't learn about till fairly recently.
Yeah.
They don't teach you this in history classes. Is how, to England, to bring the Jews back into England, that was sort of the agreement that Cromwell made to get support. And I guess it wasn't really fulfilled until, was it Charles II, if I'm not mistaken? But
because most of Cromwell's reign, he was still fighting against the loyalists of the previous king, James.
Yes.
And
of course, this also that's the 17th century. In the early 18th century, you have the establishment of the Grand Lodge in Great Britain. That's Freemasonry. Of course, Freemasonry was utilized by the British Empire to sort of to expand and maintain this empire as a system of communication, destabilization, you could say.
It's basically the Kabbalah or the Noahide laws for the Goyim. Mm-hmm. That's basically what it is.
And I guess they embrace a sort of Talmudic outlook, don't they?
Yeah, entirely. Yes. Mm-hmm. A utopianism, all these things. The idea of a chosen people, whereas with them, it's of course they say you're initiated or you're profane, mm-hmm. but it's the same thing. And the secret element, all these things. You see the Kabbalah, the Zohar, and the Talmud all over it.
Mm-hmm. And the profane since you are profane, it's okay to hoodwink the profane.
Yes. Yeah.
And
you basically trust your so-called brother before anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
So even compared to your own family, if your own family is a Mason, then you trust your brother before them.
Yes, and of course this isn't just speculation or conspiracy theory. There's a book called Builders of Empire, which a very mainstream historian writes about the key role that Freemasonry played in the expansion and maintenance of the British Empire through the lodge system. And this is secret handshakes, code words, networking. This is how you suborn or subvert existing organizations, create parallel governments. It's a very practical means of subversion, and enshrouded in ritual for whatever reason.
Yes, because you have the court system, you have the law enforcement,
mm-hmm.
you have different political parties. All these things kind of then become a means by which there could be backdoor rooms, backdoor room deals.
Yeah.
Away from the public eye.
And of course the banking system.
Yes, yeah. And different deals are made. Like mm-hmm. you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And it's all a same agenda. It's
like on Capitol Hill when Ben Bernanke was testifying and that a lowly congressman was questioning about the 20 or $25 trillion in currency swaps that they were engaging in the wake of the 2008 crash. And
credit default swaps, one of the most one of the strangest frauds. Like I don't know why people, people don't really talk about it, but yeah.
Well, the whole system is based on fraud. I mean, it's like look at the money we use. But he told a congressman that we can't tell him where the money went or who got the money because the whole banking system is Masonic. The congressman was profane. He
Well, that's another thing.
Yeah.
That's another thing. Freemasonry says that you can't, on the pain of death, of having your throat slit, as the ritual is, which I know some Masons will try to say, it's not literal, but I mean, whatever, that could be argued, but
mm-hmm.
but you see the threat of death if you expose their secrets, but likewise you see the same thing with the Talmud. The Talmud says that a Jew cannot show a non-Jew a goy the Talmud, or they'll be killed if they do. So you see that same type of element there.
Yeah.
So that's another manifestation of the Talmudic origin of that.
And I think something with the Talmud, of course, being profane when it comes to the Talmud myself, I'm not, very few are well versed in it. I mean, you can, from what I understand, it's very complex. You can devote your entire life to Talmudic study and interpretation. But, it's very much like if you're a Jewish oligarch, the higher you are, the more Talmudic you are. But as you go down the totem pole, so to speak, is, the hoi polloi, the average Jew, is only internalized only parts of the Talmud because they do it through the school system, through their Talmudic schools. But the typical Jewish fella It's just going to have the typical prejudices that any ethnic groups can have about itself towards other people. But they're going to internalize some of these things. And this, like you said, this is sort of a rabbinical strategy to maintain group cohesion.
Yes. Yeah, that's a big part of it.
Yeah. And one thing it does encourage bad behavior, and it gets the reaction. And the reaction, which is these, a pogrom or public protest or violence in some cases, that is intended because it's a strategy of tension. It's there to promote that behavior in order to enforce that group cohesion, to maintain the idea of the tribe.
Yeah. Just like how a lot of globalist strategists right now talk about controlled chaos.
Yes.
I mean, it's just basically the same thing. They want people to react that way.
Mm-hmm.
And you also see the state where it's police state laws. I mean, same thing. They want to provoke a violent response like that. Mm-hmm. So then they can come in, they can swoop in and just extend more of their power.
Mm-hmm. Because the action is in the reaction. Now, of course, as we entered into the 20th century, there was a recognition of a generally accepted idea that there was what they called the Jewish question, a Jewish problem. And
yes.
This wasn't all one way. It was acknowledged that a lot of the problems was a result of Jewish behavior. But that changed after the Second World War because of the Holocaust narrative.
Yes.
Now, of course, there's a lot of controversy about the Second World War, about what really happened, to the extent that it happened. But nevertheless, you've spoken about your problems with the Holocaust narrative. What exactly was achieved? What do you briefly? What do you think happened, and what was achieved with that narrative, and how did it fundamentally change geopolitics from the pre-war to post-war?
Okay, well, it was designed basically to get the Jews out of Europe, and that is the Zionist objective. So that's why many Zionists at the time, like Joachim Prince and Vladimir Jabotinsky and others. Well, Vladimir Jabotinsky, he made his statement a little before, but he had all these Zionists in the early 20th century talking about how Jews and Germans are different, and there should be no assimilation. So, and then you have the Jewish power in Germany between 1918 and 1933.
This is the Weimar period, yeah.
Yes, during the Weimar period, yes. And my paternal side is from Germany, so yeah, I definitely study this a lot, and yeah, I have very strong opinions about that. Yes,
the cultural degradation that was facilitated by the economic depression, that manipulated and created economic depression, because people would sell off their resources, sell themselves into prostitution, and you could come in with a foreign exchange and buy things up, even people up for pennies, more or less.
Yeah, it was horrible. It was horrible. Berlin became the hedonistic capital of the world, and it was horrible. So much degradation. You had
like Haiti today.
You had war profiteers. You had all these the financial criminals. The first financial criminals, you could argue, like stock exchange and all that, were in Germany during the Weimar time. And you had the communist revolutionaries threatening and rebellion. So on both ends, it was mostly Jews. Everywhere you looked, it was mostly Jews. And then in the cultural aspects, you had primarily Jews, and a lot of them were basically thumbing their nose at anything German, at German history, German culture. They were making fun of Germans, mocking everything German. And so this system was the system that was in the ascendancy in Germany at that time. So you had a Jewish arrogance. And
at the same time, the national reaction, which was National Socialism, that was supported by American and British funding.
Yeah, and that was part of the problem. Which and it's interesting because there's a lot of statements, and I'll point to one statement. You had Rabbi Harry Watton. He wrote a book called "A Program for Jews and an Answer to All Anti-Semites: A Program for Humanity." And this was It was published in New York City by the Committee for the Preservation of the Jews in 1939. And he basically said Nazism is an imitation of Judaism. And then you had, I mean, aside from that, you also had Julius Streicher at the Nuremberg trials. He basically admitted that it was all, they basically copied Judaism, the idea of the Talmud. But they just replaced the chosen people with the master race. So it was basically a reaction. That's what it was. It was a reaction to the Jewish supremacism, but then it made its own supremacism.
Mm-hmm.
So it was it became a dialectic. But yeah, as you alluded to, there was heavy funding, and I would advise people to look up this guy named Otto Strasser, and and his brother Gregor Strasser, and these are people within the party that they oppose Hitler's all his dealings with capitalists. And he pointed that out in 1929. He pointed out that one day, all of a sudden, Hitler had all this money, and they didn't know what happened. But other scholars have since they've highlighted the links with Montagu Norman,
mm-hmm.
with Sidney Warburg. And all these things are hard to believe
Schacht,
at all,
right?
because
Helmut
yes.
Schacht was very good friends with.
Well, yeah, he was basically their go-between. So none of this things it's not hard to believe, because Hitler made Hjalmar Schacht the economic minister mm-hmm. as soon as he took power. And you look at Hjalmar Schacht, he was one of the founders of the Bank of International Settlements. He was a Freemason. He had all these ties to British bankers. Well, mostly Jewish bankers, but Jewish bankers in Britain. He had all these internationalist ties, so he was like a go-between mm-hmm. between Hitler and them. And
throughout this whole time, you had this sort of dualism played by the British, where they put up this front as if there was sort of a sympathetic element within the British power structure towards Germany, and this was done to encourage Hitler. At the same time, the whole thing with King Edward, abdicating, with Wallace Simpson and these things, this was done to kind of goad Hitler, to trick Hitler, to think that he could somehow maybe go to war and not have to fight Britain and then get a separate peace. At the same time, of course, you have Winston Churchill coming in to power in 1940, and of course Winston Churchill, the whole Churchill family, was heavily in debt to Jewish creditors.
Yes, yeah.
And sort of his anti-German pose, the posture he took could be, I think, coincides roughly with his bailout. In 1935.
Yeah, that was part of it. That was part of it. Another element was he was one who believed strongly in the British imperialism. So mm-hmm. he did believe strongly in the idea of the British Empire, and so he did view Germany as a rival, because I forgot who he said this to, but it's verified. It could be
this is
sources. But he said that I don't care who was in power in Germany, even if it was a Catholic priest, I would still go into war against Germany.
Yeah, this is the Mackinder Doctrine, right?
Yes. The Mackinder Doctrine, yes. And also just the economic issue as well. Germany was always a rival to the British aristocracy's power.
And with the British aristocracy, this is another thing that Economic Jones talks about, and this gets into sort of the root of the problem being usury, is they were often cash poor, and they had to borrow money, and they slowly liquidated their estates in the 19th century. And so by the 20th century, the British Empire was heavily indebted to Jewish bankers. And this would factor mightily, of course, in the Balfour Declaration.
Correct? Yes. Yes, which was, it was actually addressed to one of the Rothschilds, to Edmund mm-hmm. de Rothschild. And that's something else I traced in my speech. I basically traced that mm-hmm. it's Zionism going back to the 1870s is very intricately connected to the Rothschilds. The first Zionist settlement in Palestine was actually set up by one of the Rothschilds, their money funding it. Then you had the Balfour Declaration, and, all these things.
Now, is that would you say that the Rothschilds again are using Judaism as a cover, the Jewishness, and they're just looking at the long-term strategic value of there, particularly oil, because at the same time, the British Empire was converting to petroleum. It's navy from coal to petroleum, and so that factored into the Rothschild penetration of the Middle East, because at the same in Russia, didn't you have the Noble brothers and all that going on with the Caucasus and that oil? And
yes, yeah. They had their agents everywhere, basically.
Yeah,
trying to create a system of dependency. Because these the only people that really benefit from these different resources are the corrupt governments.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how they were able to buy off influence and profit at the same time.
Yeah, like the British.
It was a multi-tiered objective of theirs.
Yeah, like of course, the British and then the Americans supporting the Sauds in Saudi Arabia. It's just a family.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's like some of the other what kind? They're like they're not really nations; they're bank accounts.
Yes, yeah.
That's what, like Kuwait, right? It's not really a nation; it's a bank account, and it's that's how the British Sykes-Picot they carved it up and all that. What's particularly striking is there's a book I read called State Secrets by Leon de Ponson.
Yeah, but they're Ponson. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, very good writer. Yeah.
Oh, did you read that book, State Secrets?
I don't have his State Secrets, but I have his. He did a book about Vatican and Judaism and Freemasonry and Judaism. So I have those two books, but I don't have State Secrets. No.
Oh, I'll have to get those ones then.
I think Secret Powers, something like that.
Interesting. Yeah, because he writes in State Secrets that it was a document, almost a threat. It's called the Landman document. And it's 1918, and it's more or less a threat of the declaration of war of the Jewish nation on the British Empire if they don't come through on the Balfour Declaration.
Oh, yeah, yes.
And so, what's funny...
I remember, I think Benjamin Friedman kind of touched upon that in his famous speech.
Yeah, here it is. I just holding the book right now. And this is written to the British government. It was under the conditions that the Anglo-American Zionists published a threatening warning to the British government by means of the Landman document, addressing the British government as if they were speaking to an equal. They said, in effect, "You forget that you did not give us Palestine as an unsolicited gift." Balfour Declaration, in parentheses. "It was handed over as a result of our secret bargain concluded between ourselves. We have scrupulously observed our part in bringing America into the war on your side. We call on you to fulfill your obligations in turn. You are aware of our power in the United States. Take care that you do not attract the hostility of Israel. Otherwise, you will come up against grave international difficulties."
Yeah.
Now, the date is 1918. That's 30 years before the founding of Israel? Yet Israel is making a threat.
Well, yeah, it's just like as soon as Hitler took power, came to power in Germany, you had Israel declares war on Germany.
Yeah, or Judea
declares yes. Yeah. So Israel is basically if you read the Talmud, Israel is a term meaning the Jewish people themselves. That's what Israel means.
And it exists anywhere where there's Jewish people.
Yes, and that's why constantly you've had Zionist leaders talk about, they speak for all the Jewish people, and that's why you have the World Jewish Congress and the World Zionist Organization. That's why you have all these things. And the Central Council of Jews in Germany. You have, and their equivalent in other countries too, but all of them basically say that it's an international group that just inhabit these different countries, but that there's a supranational structure that speaks for them.
And this is why you can have senators or like Michael Chertoff being an Israeli citizen, but also being head of Department of Homeland Security, and also investigating 9/11 and things like that. Or senators who have dual nationality. And right now, of course, then you have their I guess controlled you want to call them, but people like they're either bribed or blackmailed or both. They're not necessarily Jewish. That's that's why there's such an extensive espionage and spy network in the United States, Jewish spy work, the Mossad, is because they run these, a lot of the sex rings, human trafficking are controlled by Mossad.
Yeah, they do that. Yeah, they actually provide many of the women or children, because they cater to all kinds of perversions. So depending on what the perversion they get, they trap someone in.
That's right.
So they give them, they provide it to them, but then they say, well, but we have this information on you, so you're indebted to us now.
Yeah, I think during the 6-Day War, when U.S. Liberty was attacked, Lyndon Johnson had a Jewish mistress who was a Israeli agent for the Israeli Defense Force. Matilda,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Matilda Krem or Krem.
Okay, I'll have to look that up. Krem?
Yeah, and it's in the book. Writes about it in Guilt by Association.
Okay.
It talks about the Jewish influence in the United States, particularly after the 6-Day War. And of course, there's, Monica Lewinsky.
Yeah.
I think there was there a cable or some intersected thing where Netanyahu warned Clinton that he might be being blackmailed. Wink, wink, nod, nod.
Yeah, because there was a controversy about Agent X within the White House, who was this secret agent that they always euphemistically said a foreign power, but everybody was pretty well in agreement that it was the Mossad.
Yeah,
and so they were getting close to finding out who it was.
Well, a good example of the extent of the control is right now there is a bill in the Senate targeting the BDS movement.
Yes, yeah.
They make it illegal to advocate it or to promote it. I mean, that's that's a direct assault on free speech in political, assembly, and that's being sponsored by who is it? Is it not Corker? Who is that? Some senator? Forget.
Yeah, I don't know who's sponsoring, but
it's got
one of the Christian Zionists, the so-called Christian Zionists.
Yeah, but it's got majority support. I mean, it's unconstitutional. I mean, it's.
Well, Israel is one of the few issues that unites Democrats and Republicans. I mean, they all work together behind the scenes, but in public, they pretend to fight on everything except Israel. Whenever it comes to Israel, they're always united.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it doesn't matter Republican, Democrat, conservative, or liberal. It's all pro-Israel. They told the same line.
And that seems to be something that really came on strong in the 1970s, particularly after the 6-Day War. Is sort of the waning of the WASP establishment and the waxing of Jewish influence. This also coincides with the death of Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller in the 70s, late 70s. But really, the rise of the neoconservatives and these Trotskyites that became neoconservatives in the 70s, I guess this also, if you look at the historiography of the Second World War, is prior to the 1970s, the Holocaust narrative was not a prominent was not the prominent theme of that war. At least our understanding of the war. If you watch the war movies of the 50s and 60s, it just isn't there. But it really picks up after the 6-Day War. And of course you have the television series Holocaust.
Yeah.
I think on CBS in 1977-78. And now that defines the Second World War.
Yes. Well, even more than that, Lee, you have to go back to the Frankfurt School, for example. You have, I think it was Adorno. Yeah, Adorno said that all history has no meaning after Auschwitz. Mm-hmm. And then you have all these other elements. You have even if we could go back to the Catholic Church, for example, you have priests now saying that the worst stain in history is Auschwitz. Whereas, the biggest tragedy in human history is Auschwitz, which they're going against their own Christian dogma.
It's replacing.
And you have all these things. Yeah, Calvary, as Jobst would say.
The sacrifice on Calvary has now been supplanted by the Holocaust narrative, Auschwitz.
Yes, and no other massacre or genocide in history, real or imagined, do you have a special Remembrance Day that's, emphasized to such the extent. Do you have all these taxpayer-funded museums and memorials, TV, movies, ramming it down our throats constantly. And it's even worse in Germany. You have the financial element there and the shame and guilt aspect that they're enforcing upon the German people. But
yes, the billions that have been transferred. Of course, Norman Finkelstein writes about that in the Holocaust industry.
Yes.
And he still believes in the narrative. He's just talking about its exploitation, and for that he gets he gets thrown out of University of Minnesota, I think it was, or something. He lost his tenure.
Yes, and he was also thrown out of Germany by Gregor Gysi, which is he's a very interesting character, because this Gregor Gysi he was in the former East Germany, so he was a former Stasi agent, and he's a Jew, by the way, of course, but he and a big supporter of Israel. But he's the leader of the Die Linke, which is the Marxist party in Germany, in modern Germany, and he basically he purged all kinds of anti-Zionists from this party, and he's ensuring that it's pro-Israel. He promotes the mass immigration into Germany. He was personally involved in throwing out not only Norman Finkelstein, but Max Blumenthal, which Max Blumenthal doesn't even go as far as Finkelstein does, but still just scratching a little bit of the narrative, or the way that they they react hysterically against it.
Well, I mean, it's the only thing where if you question a certain narrative, in more than a dozen countries in the free world, so-called, you can be thrown into prison.
Yes.
And I think under German law is you can be talking about it in another country, and if you go into Germany, they can arrest you.
Yeah, just like what happened to Ernst Lundell.
Yes, I mean the
U.S. and Canadian governments basically they were complicit in this.
They chased him out of Canada and the United States, and they let him get deported. They had some pretext that, on his application that he'd signed decades before. He was just an artist in Canada who started writing these pamphlets, and and then solitary confinement, and now he's back in Germany. He's all quiet, doesn't say anything. He's obviously older now, but even if you have a problem with what he's saying, the fact that just a mere opinion can bring on a jail sentence should be enough to raise doubt about what they're trying to protect. Because after all, if it is indeed the truth, what type of truth needs to be defended by threats of imprisonment or harassment?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly what are they scared of? I mean, let there be a free debate. That's what the revisionists constantly say. They say, we don't care if you accept what we say. Just let us debate it, and then let people decide for themselves.
Well, that's the problem with that with that particular issue, because I've expressed skepticism before, just based on my research. I'm looking for the evidence, and it just isn't there. In fact, it's quite the contrary.
Yes.
It is a war atrocity story, the same ones that were told in the First World War. It's just that a different circumstances. Germany wasn't totally defeated in the First World War, and not
only that, but the so-called 6 million that goes back to in 1919 in the Ukraine. They were trying to claim that there were 6 million Jews that were massacred in the Ukraine at that time, and you had a lot of the big newspapers reporting on it. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, they kind of let that issue die, and they never picked it up again.
Yeah, a lot of people just accept that as truth because of Nuremberg, because of the war. The films we saw, of course, if you study the films, these were propaganda films. Some were faked. Some were actually, bomb victims being used, or typhus victims. The conditions.
Yeah, I had relatives in Germany at that time. German Gentiles. They were German and Spanish, like ethnic mix, and Gentiles. And they were suffering these same conditions. It was throughout Europe, conditions of famine and starving, disease and stuff. It was all throughout Europe. So why should the concentration camps be any different? But it was the same outside the concentration camps. It was just food was scarce. Disease was spreading. So why single out the Jews as like that somehow that's proof of being exterminated?
Well, that was there's obviously as Germany's war, as their war effort became more desperate and their economy collapsed, conditions all throughout, like you said, were going to deteriorate, and they did in the camps, particularly after 1944, largely a consequence of the Allied bombing. And there's even a case, I think in Belsen or Buchenwald, where they claim that people were machine gunned to death in a transport train. It turns out they were machine gunned by American fighters because the caliber of the weapons were such that they're used by American weapons, but they blamed it on the Germans. So
yeah, and that was common throughout Germany. In fact, like if you look at the bombings of German cities, and my family's city was Stuttgart, so it suffered the same thing. You had these mostly American fighter jets kind of strafing people.
Yeah, the P-51 Mustangs.
Yes, yeah. So it was the same throughout occupied Europe.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the destruction of the cities itself is one of the more horrible war crimes of that war, because no one was ever prosecuted for them because that side won. But the destruction of German cities, also Japanese cities, the strategic bombing survey of 1946 concluded that it actually detracted from the war effort, if you're going to resort to that justification for that. But I do think that the destruction of the German cities was a part of the psychological decapitation of the German nation, sort of a fulfillment not only of the Mackinder Doctrine, but also perhaps an application of the Morgenthau Plan.
Yeah, it was all these things. You had the Morgenthau Plan, which was the starvation, forcing the starvation upon the Germans. You had the Kaufmann Plan, so that Theodor Kaufmann mentioned about, he wanted to sterilize the Germans. Mm-hmm. Then you had one of the Rothschilds during that time talked about splitting up Germany among the different countries. So that was another plan. You had all these different, very anti-German genocidal plans. And go back to the boycott of that was declared in 1933. All these leaders of different global Jewish organizations, they were openly talking in very genocidal terms.
Yeah, that's the funny thing about that. I mean, one of the more curious things about that is you have a lot of historians who pride themselves on going through the research, going through the documents, not speculating and relying on the evidence. Yet when it comes to this topic, there's no demand for evidence. There's just horror stories, gruesome horror stories that simply, I'm sorry, just can't withstand scrutiny, just a common sense, because it's not impossible. But the failure to manifest any documents that show a plan for annihilation. There's not one document to show that this was the plan. There's nothing out there.